Okay, perfect. So welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to have this mixed session between teaching and book presentation, which is actually cutting across many continents around the world. We have, I think, more than 20 countries represented among the participants, and I'm very happy for that. Also in different time zones, and this is what technology allows these years, which I think can be an advantage sometime, definitely. So we have the pleasure to discuss Professors Yvonne Rydin, newest publication. It came out it's really hot off the press. It just several weeks, which is out. We got it just 1 week ago at the University of Vienna in the library. So we were able to share it with our students here as well. And I will now briefly introduce the author and the discussants, and then we can start with the presentation. So Yvonne Rydin is a professor of planning, environment, and public policy at the Bartlett School of Planning at the UCL London, University College London. I would say almost 20 years. And before that, she was 16 years at LSE, and I'm not going further back. So in these 3 decades, more or less, of experience, her work was significantly shaped the field of urban planning and sustainability governance. And this is an interesting combination because her research is also trying to explore how governance frameworks for sustainable development might unfold in different contexts, in different geographies, in different institutional arrangements, which is, of course, one of the big challenges we have to face. She has authored and edited very many books and publications: Theory for Planning Research in 2021, Regulation and Planning Practices, Institutions and Materiality. And her most recent work deals with the post-growth planning, which is also the topic of today's presentation and discussion. Her contribution has been pivotal, I would say, definitely path-breaking. And it's one of the most heard voices around this topic. And she compared also different institutional contexts, which are important to understand how degrowth cannot unfold in the same way, in different contexts. And I think it's a very important element to be considered. We have the pleasure today to discuss the book Planning Without Growth. So the title already, it's very telling. And she tries to push the boundaries of planning theory and practice in that specific direction. And we have 2 distinguished discussants as well. We have Federico Savini and Christian Lamker. Federico Savini is Associate Professor of Environmental Planning in also institutions and politics, so very similar actually label to your position at the University of Amsterdam. And his research interests, I would say, overlap more or less 100% with that of Yvonne. Well, not 100%, but 95%.
Let's see.
And the focus is also on urban governance, sustainability, social political dynamics, and urban development. So that's definitely. He got an ERC on this topic, actually, on post-growth planning. And he published a few years back, in the meantime, a book, Post-Growth Planning, Cities Beyond the Market Economy, which we also discussed in this Hot Off the Press series. And actually, Yvonne was the discussant at that time. So we reversed roles today. Christian Lamker is an assistant professor at sustainable transformation and regional planning at the University of Groningen, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Also, his research focuses on post-growth planning and sustainable land use and the social-political dimensions of spatial planning, to which he contributed significantly. So both have a lot to say about the topic, and I would like to leave the floor to Yvonne for her presentation now. So the format is clear: half an hour, 40 minutes presentation, then 5 to 10 minutes comments and questions, then a quick response by Yvonne, and then we open up the floor for questions to everybody. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yuri. Thank you for the invitation. to this exciting event. You're right, the book has only been published at the end of February, so it is still very warm. I'm also delighted to share the virtual stage with Christian and Federico, who've been very important in connecting my work, which was going along on its own path, with prevailing degrowth and post-growth debates. So I want to acknowledge their influence on this, not that that affects what they may say in criticism afterwards. So, okay, so I think we know that we have a problem with economic growth. Many of these problems are environmental in nature and are strongly emphasized by the prevailing economic literature around resource waste, pollution, overuse of sinks, disruption of ecosystems, loss of biodiversity. Some of these problems are social in kind, the failure to address inequality, and indeed the growth in poverty, often associated with the shift in employment patterns to the precariat under current patterns of economic growth. Perhaps today, this week, we are also very aware of the inherent economics instability of contemporary systems that are oriented towards growth. And there's also been the literature which unpacks the measurements of economic growth in terms of GNP, GDP, and highlighting how this is a fundamental misdirection of policy, that these measurements are in many senses false. But I'm particularly interested in the planning systems. I come from a planning school. And so what I'm interested in is the way that planning systems have, sorry, I just want to minimize my screen, have a problem with growth as well. And I think the problem is that they have become oriented towards growth. They have become overwhelmingly focused on seeking to promote local economic growth. And the path they often see is through inward investment of various kinds. This approach looks at the market for guidance. So it uses market-led urban development as part of this strategy. So it's a property-led approach in many cases, and it's a property approach that is led itself by the market and by private sector signals. And it's often associated with promoting visions of a knowledge economy form of local economic development. Almost every area seems to think they can buy into the quaternary transition and have high wage economy led by knowledge workers. And you find this increasingly in planning documents, even in situations where that vision seems a little bit unlikely. They've also, I would say, gone beyond being oriented towards growth to become dependent on growth. So they see that the promotion of market-led urban development as the way to deliver on social and environmental goals. So in that particular case, what they're doing is seeking to take a share of the development profits and land value uplifts that come with market-led urban development, and then reorienting some of that to deliver on social and environmental benefits. There's a lot of debate about how far they go in delivering on these social and environmental goals, whether they do so equitably as well. But I would say the problem that this involves is that the ability to develop local economic growth in this way is reliant on wider economic conditions. And, you know, I think it's a real issue, actually, whether we are not currently in high-income countries like Europe actually promoting entering an era in which those conditions will just not be there. It is spatially very uneven as an approach. It does not work everywhere, even if planning authorities would like to promote this vision everywhere. It is very spatially uneven in its dynamics. It has been shown again and again to result in socially inequitable outcomes, usually through the processes of dispossession and gentrification. And it has also demonstrated quite limited potential to deliver environmental sustainability gains. Win-win options are prioritized, by which I mean those that options that can deliver environmental sustainability benefits, but also economic benefits as appreciated by the private sector and market signals. So things like green spaces, you know, the things that are known to deliver economic value, market value, are very often prioritized. And the problem that I came to this whole issue through was it seemed that it leaves areas of low market demand largely untouched, which means that areas that are not subject to those market demands are essentially without planning in those particular cases. Now, I set out these arguments, excuse me, in my book from a decade ago called The Future of Planning. I mean, the title should have been the subtitle, which is Beyond Growth Dependence. But since that time, it's been clear that this approach of growth-dependent planning has remained with us. So our last government promoted this very strongly, essentially arguing that King's Cross, those of you that have come in perhaps through the Eurostar into London will know King's Cross. It's pictured on the right of the slide. They felt this could be a template for regeneration more generally. So back in 23, the department we had at the time said it was working with Leeds, Cambridge, London, Barrow, Blythe, Blackpool, Sheffield, and Wolverhampton to replicate that strategy. Now, those of you that know England may think, okay, London, Cambridge is a very buoyant kind of place, but I have to tell you that Blythe, Barrow, and Blackpool and Wolverhampton do not have the same market conditions that this area of London, next to three major national transport hubs and an international transport hub, have. But our current government, because the last government was a Conservative government, and since last year we've had a Labour government, but our new Labour government is also going the same route. It is going for growth. This is very clear in all its strategies and its approach. And it is using the planning system and what it terms reform of the planning system to drive that through a planning and infrastructure bill, which it says will help drive economic growth and make Britain a clean energy superpower. So this approach is still live. But the question is there an alternative? And there are a whole variety of debates going on, which I review in the book, about alternatives approaches to this. Some of these are about sustainable development as a form of good growth, following through the SDGs, etc., the Sustainable Development Goals. We have the donut economics from Kate Raworth, which is arguing, I think, again, essentially as a kind of a good growth kind of approach, not too much, not too little, what we call Goldilocks, sort of just right type amount of growth. We have the green growth approach of a green transition, of win-win outcomes everywhere, of green technology being able to deliver environmental benefits at the same time as economic benefits. We have the circular economy approach, seeking to ensure that all outputs become inputs again. And we have the degrowth literature itself, which takes on a more international perspective in a way, and is arguing for the need for higher income countries to actually roll back on their levels of economic activity if we're going to sustain sustain ecosystems at the global scale. Now, some of these are, to be honest, I think unlikely to deliver. I'm a bit of a pragmatist. I operate in a planning school where the emphasis on how to teach policy actors to behave and to achieve change. So I'm less personally interested in those that are unlikely to deliver, although I recognize their importance as a kind of moral imperative, as a normative debate to drive change at that scale. Some are politically unacceptable, and if we live in democracies, we need to have regard to how we can actually get electorates to support something that we see as delivering a sustainable future. Some just lack incentives for change and are essentially exhortations to be different. And I find this quite frustrating in the environmental literature. If people only thought like, green people think, then everything would be right. Well, yes, but they don't. So how do we handle that? Some assume cultural change is easier to achieve than I think it often is. And I think some of that is quite out of date because it often is pre-populist politics in its approach. And some are mainly concerned with measurement frameworks and how we measure things. So in the book, I argue for a different kind of approach. I see the challenge of planning without growth as essentially an economic one, and it involves a shift from rethinking the relationship of planning to economic growth to rethinking the nature of the economy itself. And just be clear here, I'm not talking about a new vision of what the economy might be like. I'm talking about a better understanding of the way the economy actually is, because I think our contemporary accounts of economic growth are a blinkered view of the way that economic activity as the production and distribution and consumption of goods and services actually operates. And so I've used the insights of two key frameworks in this book. The first is the diverse economies work, based on Gibson Graham's publications. And it's a particular reading. I take that of their approach. But what I really took from them was that economic activity is already based on different forms of transactions, labor, and enterprise. We have a tendency when we focus on economic growth and we focus on the private sector and we focus, to be honest, on the euro or dollar or pound signs, we are focusing on market-based activities and capitalist activities. And they argue that there's a whole variety of alternative market or alternative capitalist forms of trading goods and services, employing labor, promoting enterprise. And there are also non-market or unpaid or non-capitalist versions of this as well. So they see the diverse economy as combining the market economy with the social economy of activities, organizations such as cooperatives, social enterprises, etc., and civil society itself, where a lot of unpaid economic work actually occurs. And of course, feminist economists have for a long time been arguing that the reproduction of labor, the role of care, the work of care in the household, is an important part of the way the economy operates. The other framework that I've used has been the foundational economy, developed by the Foundational Economy Collective up at Manchester, but also increasingly with work at Cardiff universities as well. And this also emphasizes different types of economic activity, but it cuts the cake in a slightly different way. It emphasizes the tradable economy, the market economy, but it also emphasizes the overlooked economy, the economy of many goods and services that are important to people's everyday lives, but are overlooked because they are essentially low value. Because economics operates with the metric of the dollar, the pound, the euro, the bigger the dollar, the pound, and the euro quantum, the more important that activity is assumed to be. And the foundational economy challenges that and says that things that are low value in market terms can still be important, particularly to local communities and localities. They also identify the providential economy, which is the range of safety nets that we need if we fall on hard times, many of them provided through the state, but not only through the state. We have the material economy, which is particularly around the utilities and infrastructures we rely on. And again, they emphasize the role of family and civil society, which they term the core economy. So together, I've used this as a way of thinking about the kinds of initiatives that, as it were, could take us beyond the emphasis on growth, the orientation and the dependence on growth. And that is the way that I've understood Christian Lamker's term of post-growth planning in this. So in the book, I look at a range of potential post-growth initiatives. I look at SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly the smaller end of that. So I include in here things that are part of the market economy because I think they are an important part of diverse economies, but not considered enough. I look at cooperatives, I look at social enterprises, I look at community land trusts, all of which might be considered part of the social economy. I look particularly how these relate to community infrastructure, and I look at urban commoning. And while the book itself draws on a wide review of the research literature in these areas, it also includes some original material in terms of focal points, and they're illustrated on this slide. So top right-hand side, in terms of looking at small businesses, I look particularly at the town of Shildon up in County Durham in the northeast, which is variously referred to as a left behind, low value sort of place, not really a focus of the county's local economic development policy, but a place with a very active civil society and a very large number of small and micro businesses operating on industrial estates like this one here, the Double Duck Industrial Estate. Looking at co-ops, I look particularly at Sweden because Sweden has a strong tradition of cooperatives, particularly in agriculture, in retail and in housing. Less so in terms of manufacturing. They are not a Mondragon type situation, but it's interesting to see a case there where cooperatives have been well embedded. I look at social enterprises, particularly as they deliver on community assets. And the picture on the bottom right is from Letterfract on the western coast of Ireland, a peripheral, largely rural area where you have buildings like this. This actually used to be a former industrial school. and it's now been taken over by the local community, and it provides a mix of market-oriented and community-oriented activities, including a woodworking training setup, an actual furniture restoration enterprise, a community radio, some holiday visiting accommodation, and so on and so forth. Very typical of these social enterprises that they provide these mix of kind of uses to develop a viable package. In terms of community land trusts, I looked at Brussels, where Community Land Trust Brussels is an integral part of the way that housing for more affordable housing is provided for communities in the city, particularly in the Western Arc. We have a lot of first, second, third generation migrant communities. But CLT Brussels have now got themselves written into the way the region is actually undertaking its planning, which is interesting. In terms of community infrastructure, I particularly looked at community energy infrastructure. In the book, I focused particularly on community energy infrastructure initiatives in France. But the picture here is actually of the development of a micro hydro plant in Oxford. And lastly, I look at urban commoning, and I particularly look at urban commoning in terms of urban gardens and orchards and food projects and such. And the picture is actually from Liverpool, where there's been quite a lot of guerrilla gardening happening again. So from looking at these different types of initiatives and looking at them as they operate in particular places, I drew 5 insights. And from these, I have drawn out some implications for local and for national planning. And I'll talk about those and then leave it open for discussion. So the insights. Firstly, looking across these, it's clear about the essential hybridity of organizations that are engaged in providing goods and services across market and civil society divides. I think when you look at much larger organizations, I think they're also hybrid, but they tend to be hybrid, to be honest, across the market and the state, because the state exists very often to support what they see as these higher value, bigger parts of the economy as they measure it. But if you're looking across diverse economies and foundational economies, then it's the hybridity across the market and civil society that is really important. And that means the second insight is that the importance of fostering both the local existing business community and the local social economy. These are quite vulnerable organizations within here. And therefore, there is an actual need for planning to go in and support them and make them stronger, more robust within the local areas. Again, following on from this, it points to the central importance of social capital to these diverse economies. Now, social capital is very often understood in relation to local residential communities and how they can, in a sense, be a community through tight links, through common norms and values. But I think social capital is a broader concept than that. And it is about good connections, good local linkages. It is about norms such as trust, reciprocity, and mutuality. But such social capital is important not just to residential communities, it's important to local business communities too, as Robert Putnam showed some time back. And subsequent research has also shown that particularly small businesses in the local community need social capital to thrive also. And social economy organizations are centrally dependent on social capital because they are this mix of the market and the non-market, the paid and the unpaid. And it's the unpaid non-market aspect is really only thrives where you have strong social capital. So social capital is absolutely central to developing some kind of alternative to the kind of economies that growth-dependent planning is focused on. It's clear that all the organizations that I looked at here require knowledge. They require knowledge of detailed contractual relationships, of business models, often of legal issues as well. And these are organizations that lack capacity, they lack time, they often lack expertise. And therefore, their knowledge of these things is obviously constrained. And rather than taking these very resource-poor organizations and forcing them to reinvent the wheel, it's clear that there are real benefits to circulating knowledge of these contractual relationships and business models, and I would add property relationships as well, as you'll see in a minute. It's circulating that amongst the social economy, the business economy in these localities. And lastly, to recognize the importance of land ownership. Again, these can be very vulnerable organizations. Providing land ownership and property rights not only gives them security in terms of where they operate, it prevents them from being dispossessed, for instance, by other developers coming into an area, but it also provides an asset that they can leverage to support the viability of their activities. So from these 5 broader insights, I'll just draw out the implications, firstly for local and then for national planning. What can local planning do? Well, I think local planning is centrally involved in providing knowledge about a locality. Friedman reminded us that planning is knowledge in action. So what kind of knowledge is relevant in these cases? Well, knowledge of local communities, both business, social economy, and civil society communities is absolutely essential. And some of my colleagues here, John Tomini, Lucy Natarajan, and others, Mifamwe Taylor, have been engaged in developing what they call deep place understandings of localities that is much broader in this kind of way. Knowledge of local land and property ownership is also important. I think one of the problems we have with planning is that management and usually facilitation of urban development has come rather divorced from land policy. Land policy and knowledge about land and property should, it seems to me, be central to planning activities. So a better understanding of that is often a first step in making that happen. Local plans and local planning regulation can be used firstly to protect the land and built environment assets of importance to local communities. And I would particularly point to the importance of social infrastructure, libraries, community centres, education setups, etc. Again, my colleagues, John Tomini, Lucy Natarajan, and Mifamwe Taylor have pointed out how important this kind of infrastructure is to building social capital. So it's not just about protecting particular bits of the built environment, it's the knock-on effects on creating this stronger mesh of social capital. But local plans and planning regulation can also be used to facilitate alternative land ownership and business models. It can protect areas for these new models to actually operate. It can protect areas, say, where community land trusts are the favoured form of development. And above all, I think local planning needs to bring community development, local economic development, and planning back together into a much closer dialogue. They become rather separated out, and planning's become, certainly in my experience in the UK, very narrow in how it approaches its work. National policy, I would like to see planning of the built environment recognised as materialising and embedding social capital. That's one of the key roles that planning should be actually doing. There is a need for policies, programmes and funds to support the building of local social capital. It needs some input there to actually resource that. Similarly, at national level is where you'll find legal recognition of the land ownership right of social enterprises and small firms occurring. And that can happen alongside funds for acquisition and management support as well. Within the UK, we do actually have more of this happening in Scotland than we do in the other parts of the United Kingdom. And just to go back to this point about knowledge of business models, property rights, contractual arrangements, as well as entrepreneurial and management skills that community groups and small businesses strongly need, that is something that obviously could be more sensibly managed at the national level, even if it then feeds through the local scale. So to summarize, and I am going to just have a very small caveat at the end about environmental issues before I finish, but to summarize this argument for planning without growth, I think such initiatives can be a key way to move away from planning's dominant focus on large and new-scale urban development. They're a way of supporting local livelihoods and well-being, but they don't embroil one in the pressures for economic growth. They can be ways of offering improvement to localities where those market pressures are absent. And that means planning can be something that operates even in those localities, not something that's purely about the big growth poles. And I think this approach engages with and enhances the lived reality of diverse economies. Just to say a point about post-growth initiatives and the environment, we do need to recognise that not all such post-growth initiatives have environmental goals or are well oriented to achieve resource finishes. Many of the organizations I've been looking at do not have sufficient knowledge for this in the first place, let alone time or incentives to engage with it. And so I think that means that environmental regulation remains a vital element alongside encouraging the thicker, more diverse kinds of economies. And I also think we need to recognize that infrastructure doesn't just happen at this more localized scale. There is a need to use the regional and national infrastructures to reduce carbon emissions centrally. So one of the tasks for planning then is to think about how to link local infrastructure initiatives with those at broader scales. And that is an issue that I try to tackle at the end of the book. But for those that say, well, this is fine, but this is all very, very small scale initiatives, and that's not the reality of what we are seeing reported in the news every day in the face of Trump's, whatever you want to call them. I would ask you to remember that the diverse economy is already with us. And what we're looking is about thickening this diverse economy, making it stronger, rebalancing away from a concern with the, just the market end of that economy to these other elements as well. There are millions of civil society organizations. They employ about 5% of the active population in Europe, but with many, many more volunteers. In most of these organizations, the volunteers way outnumber the paid employees. Social enterprises in Europe are expected to accounted for about 10% of business organizations and 6% of employment. I think because of the difficulties of how you measure that, I suspect it's likely to be much, much larger than that. And small enterprises are major employers in Europe. You can see there that the darker color in the pie chart are those small businesses employing less than 50. In terms of output, in terms of turnover, the figure looked different, but the point, that's not necessarily the point. The point is really much more about employment and about what they're up to. And they're half of the market economy, if you look at it in that kind of way. So I end with my own little market offer. If you go to the website and you put that discount code in, or if you use the Q code, you get a 20% discount on my book. So, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So if you want to take a note of that code, because I'm going to stop sharing in a minute.
Okay. So thanks a lot, Yvonne. It was very clear, very well structured, very precise. I guess we will have a lot of questions afterwards. But before that, I would like to give the floor to the discussants. First, Federico, if you don't mind, and Christian afterwards. So, Federico, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yuri. No, I don't mind to start. And also thank you for inviting me to reflect on the work of Yvonne. This is not the first time we do that, actually. We already did it a few times in the past year. And what I'm going to say, it's something that is connected to a debate we had in writing. And it's actually just out, hot off the press, also on the journal Planning Theory. So I invite also the audience to look there. What happened there is basically that Yvonne gave a very nice response that was based on her book, actually, I think, to my own article on strategic planning for degrowth. And then I had the opportunity to respond to her response. So it was a very nice conversation. I was honored to have that conversation. Now, the core of that debate was this pragmatist approach that Yvonne has just explained. So the pragmatist approach of the book of Yvonne, as far as I understand it, this is my understanding of the book, is an approach that looks at the present, at what is possible in the present in order to understand what is the future, and also looks at, as she just framed in her presentation, on what is actually, to a certain degree, acceptable and feasible, building on the democratic conditions of politics that we have today. And that approach was, to a certain degree, set let's say, in contrast with my approach that was rather pointing out at the thinking in terms of political conflict and the creation of new institutional frameworks that would, in fact, stimulate a different economy, focus more on values than practices. Now, I don't want to go too much into that detail, but for me, what is very important to say is that when we talk about the foundational economy, the diverse economy, so that economy that exists today, as Yvonne has just shown the last slide, there is a big misunderstanding, in my view. Because while this foundational economy is already there, we at the same time have serious problem with the current system that pursue economic growth and leads to all those damages that Yvonne started with in her presentation. What I want to say is that there is no contradiction between the two. We can have a large, diverse foundational economy and at the same time have a mass-scale destruction of the environment and a mass-scale exploitation of labor, which leads to all kinds of problems that we heard in the presentation. So in fact, the misunderstanding for me is that we should not think about a transition to a better economy as an additional process. We need to stimulate the diverse economy in order, perhaps, to create or trigger a process that will change the economic system. In other words, it's not enough to add or support the existing foundational economy in order to dismantle the existing institutional political power system that sustain the current growth economy. The two things can well coexist together. And the proof of that is the fact that CO2 emissions are rising everywhere, material footprint is rising everywhere, circular economy practices exist, but at the same time, a lot of funds still go into fossil fuels and linear economies. So these things happen at the same time. Cooperatives, I mean, I study cooperatives in practice for years. They exist very well in the city next to mass, large-scale private developments. So in fact, for me, the additional perspective of sustaining the financial economy is not enough. What we should do instead is finding a political process or a political analysis and political critique that is able to undo or to reduce the bad things we do rather than improve the good things that are already there. I hope it's clear, my point. So I think this is the core of the debate. Now, this debate on how to do this process, of course, can draw very much from the insights of Yvonne's book. The 5 insights of planning are very useful. Of course, I agree very much. We should not look for revolutionary purism. So think about hybridity between state and markets. We should foster local economies, social enterprises, create momentum by building social capital, harness local capacities. And of course, we should stabilize common and public property rights that protect those foundational economies. These are great suggestions for planners today. But when I talk to planners in practice and I tell them this, they always go back to the same problem and say, yes, I want to do this, but this is not the system in which I work on. I cannot give more public land to cooperatives because we need large-scale housing development. Or I can give I can do some experiments of energy cooperatives, but then we still need large-scale district heating, large-scale deployment of renewable energies. And the large-scale deployment of renewable energies are today done by companies like Shell in the country where I live. So in fact, this planner sees very clearly these goals as important, these insights as important, but they find themselves confronted with the political power system in which they operate. Often are very frustrated. And this is very much showed also by the work by Christian that studied and talked to these planners. So my point is, what we miss, both within planning and in the debates on post-growth economics, is a political analysis and a political theory of change that can help to create these new conditions for, in fact, allowing the foundational economy to really flourish, to get in space. The space that now is occupied by the non-foundational economy. Let's put it this way. So this is a bit my critique to this view, which I think is extremely important because these insights are in fact useful in practice. Now, this critique, I want to conclude, is not only addressed to, of course, the pragmatist thinking that Yvonne has developed, to which I'm highly sympathetic, but it's also addressed, I want to say, to the wider post-growth economics and degrowth economics debate, which is done in other fields like economics, environmental economics, sociology, history, and geography. there as well, we see that there is a big lack of planning thought and big lack of theory of change, able to explain how, in fact, the new economy, the foundational economy of the future can indeed take the space or take space from the existing corporate and grow economy. So also there, I think this planning debate is missing. And I think that books like the one of Yvonne are very good in trying to bridge this kind of debate. And I think her slide where she shows the different terminologies used from donut economic to foundational well-being economics is very useful. And what you see from that image is that indeed there's a lot of discussion and a lot of awareness of the pitfalls of the current system within other disciplines. And I would invite those disciplines to read more books like the one of Yvonne and the books from the planning field, because they don't do it so much, I have to be honest. When I read these works, I don't see them engaging with planning literature, which at the same time is very useful to think about this process of change, of undoing things that we do wrong and improving and strengthening the good things that we do well already. That's my comment for the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Federico. I think you provided a lot of food for thought, also for the audience. Yvonne, would you prefer to answer immediately, or we can hear Christian and then you have a collective answer to both?
I'll wait.
Okay, perfect. Okay, Christian.
Okay, then I will just continue. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I read
Very
Yvonne's book, and it was a great pleasure also as one with a background in spatial planning in all my education. So then especially concerned with not only what could be out there in some distant future, but more what could I also do today? Not me at the university maybe, but more the practicing planners also out there. I prepared actually a few slides with some points.
You can share them, yes.
Yeah, I will just about to do that with what came into my mind. You should be able to see them now. So first, Yvonne worked very well to the future of planning, the book, something like 12 years ago, which was also foundational for my own thinking in that way. Future of planning beyond growth dependence, recognizing this history of pro-growth planning. But on the other side, seeing hope and agency towards planning futures. When I looked into Yvonne's book, I read the word hope, I think twice in only the last 3, 4, 5 sentences, at least on the last page. So there's some clear relation that I'm very much supportive that planning is about having an idea, a direction for the future, not sitting back, but thinking what's the idea of planning in there. And that's what Federico describes often. On the one side, what can I actually do in this type of system? On the other side, if there's such a system clash, it should not be not doing anything or saying, there's nothing I can do. So that's kind of pushing the same boundary, maybe from two sides, you could say, and then finding also hope or agency in what we do right now, and what also planners do in their daily actions when they deal with small, medium enterprises, when they try to figure out what is a social enterprise actually. Some of them might not be profit-oriented, some are. So also understanding the potential can be quite important. Then I thought over the last few years already, what does it actually mean to be radical? So, and what it means to be radical might be quite different from a planning perspective, talking about spatial questions, than from an economic perspective. And then it can seem quite radical as a planner to think about other economic systems. On the other side, I did some reading into system theory, and you could argue maybe the most radical is to think about what could I make different? How could my own agency be different, even if it's only a slight difference? Depending on what you argue is radical, I would say it's quite radical also to get to the daily lives of thousands of planners around, maybe millions even across the globe, that are connected to daily actions. If each of them only pushes a small pragmatic button, it might even be radical for each of them and radical in the final outcome. I would say we I'm very fascinated that we have this book now, because we need to talk about alternatives. We need to talk alternatives in the way Federico has proposed, and that's also wonderful argumentation in planning theory. I really recommend to read that. I did that again yesterday, all kind of three works after one another. Because also practically growth reaches the limits of that. But we are having this debate of how far are we able to do things by hacking the system that we have? Also, how much trust do we have in the system as it is? Or how much is it about reinventing something more fundamentally different, and maybe that is even hindered by changing slight things? So I'm also more tending to, as a planner in particular, that there are potential to change within planning, not pushing aside the wider systemic change. Some reflections that also came into my mind, that there's still overall a bit of a lack of understanding of economic processes, economic actions in planning. I think that's also underlying Yvonne's book quite in particular, and also how growth in economic terms, growth in spatial terms relate to each other, and what is actually part of this calculation. So I think there's quite a lot of work also in wider economic debates that is not fully radical per se, but that could help for the future to understand us also better, how we can regain agency. In a sense, I would say, dealing with small, medium enterprises, planning does not only shape a land market, in a sense, that's a classic view of planning, but in that sense, planning even shapes markets, or could find ways. I'm happy about Yvonne's reflection on that, to shape markets for these different type of activities. And I think we still lack some clear tools and ways. How can we use planning in this way as an activity, shaping then the way how these small, medium-sized enterprises, how they first evolve, and second, not anything that is small is necessarily good. So that size is also not a criterion, but what they actually do and how they work and what the underlying logic is. That's my short reflection here, and now I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Christian. I would say, Yvonne, if you would like to.
Yeah, very briefly. Thanks, of course, to Christian and Federico. I mean, it seems to me, putting the thoughts together, that there are three issues here. The first is about first steps. You know, what are the right first steps? Are they big enough steps? And how do we move on from those steps? And I think there's a different points of view as to what are the right first steps to take, and then in particular how to move on from them. I think in my book I focus more on my view of what the first steps are, perhaps less. That's perhaps the next thing to look at is how you develop that into something more fundamental. The second thing that seems to be in here is what the role of the planner is. Okay, and I think both, you know, a lot of these debates are specifically about planning education and planning studies and planning practices in some kind of way. I think as educators, I think it's quite important that we open up people who are going to be planners to a variety of opportunities, to a variety of different possibilities, including radical opportunities as well. So we are increasingly teaching post-growth, you know, to our planners as well. I think Christian is absolutely right that we need to teach our planners more understanding of economics. I think they're much more comfortable with sociological analysis than they are with economic analyses. And I think we need to strengthen that in order to enable them to open up their minds to a greater number of possibilities. But I think we also need to recognize that when they go into practice, that very often closes things down. And in a sense, you know, it's a question of how much we can expect people in those positions to actually do in that kind of way. And I think that brings me back to the third issue here, which is about the scope for broader political critique, as Federico says, for a broader vision, for a shift in a debate about values as well. And I think my feeling there is that society is changing and has been changing. And I'm not sure we yet have the right vision for our times of how to make the future different. I mean, it's clear that sort of appeals to science aren't the panacea that they were in the past. You know, that even claims to certain sort of universal and collective values don't work as well in populist times. So I don't really have an answer here, but I think I've been thinking quite a lot about sort of knowledge and also about ignorance in relation to planning practice. And I feel that the call for a new vision, for a new set of values, for that kind of political critique has to look forward. It can't look back to what worked in the past or didn't work in the past, but to examples from the past. I think now is the moment to be thinking about something quite radically different about how we envisage the future in what is increasingly being dominated by populist politics. So first steps and how we move on from them, what the role of the planner actually is, and how we develop the vision for our times of the future. I seem to be the very broad things I would take from these responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. I would say we can open up the floor now for questions from the audience, both from the students of the different classes, we have also people from geography connected and sociology and other disciplines as well. But whoever wants to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand or write it in the chat.
There is one raised hand already
by
Kim Carlotta von Schönfeld. Welcome.
Hi, yes.
Go
Wow,
ahead.
it's been a long time since someone knew how to pronounce my name in these kinds of things. Not been in a German-speaking context so often. Thank you so much, Yvonne, and to the commentators as well. It's been really, refreshing to get back more into this topic. And I wanted to raise something that somehow hasn't come up here, but I find extremely relevant, which is related to digitalization. And the fact that I feel that this in a way, this actual lack of knowledge that we see here among planners of, for example, what Yvonne pointed out of how land property is dealt with, etc. I feel like a lot of this has to do with how distant planners end up making their work in relation to that which is going on the ground in the places that they are working about. And I think a lot of that has to do with how much both education and practice are going towards this digitalized way of working, in which everything goes through the computer, everything goes through modeling, everything goes through some kind of, even if you are not using a model, you're always collecting data, you're always trying to, make something look, analyze something at a higher level. While I think that you seem to be calling, Yvonne, for something a bit more down to earth and a bit more, in that sense, also localized. So I really appreciate that also in this sense. And I think perhaps considering how much all this digitalization and data collection is connected to the economy, the knowledge economy, and the economies that are, especially, the meta economies and the economies of the very rich nowadays are so closely connected to this digital side. I wonder if there's something to explore there in terms of post-growth, to say, if we try to move away from this digitalization process, and especially this obsession with data and with working at computers and so on, if that is part of a key as well in terms of how we might work in the future and plan in the future.
There are also
Yeah, I saw some questions also in the chat, but maybe if Yvonne wants to answer.
So we collect that. Well, I mean, I really appreciate Kim's comment, but shall we collect a few thoughts,
we
and
can do that.
then we can respond to them?
So I can read it out, or I don't know if Kaspar Rabt wants to ask the question himself.
Hi, I think I can also, if you can understand me, this is quite a loud environment.
No,
Ask the question myself. So Actually, I'm writing my thesis right now, and I'm taking as a start point the wonderful discourse you had in the journal Planning Theory. I really enjoyed it. Let me emphasize that again. And I think one question remains for me from the perspective of Yvonne's proposals, because whilst I agree on the practicality of these, and whilst I agree that we should protect these prefigurative practices, I also agree on that in practice that is often not possible as soon as you go into the profession. And in the beginning, you said that that you are focusing on the practical things, and this is how I understood it, why you do not take into account a large-scale shift in culture, because you say it's not really feasible. And also because of the urgency of the situation, we don't have the time to go into that large-scale cultural change. We have to do something now, is what I understand. And I think that this is where I have my question, because I do not understand quite now how protecting these prefigurative practices from the hegemony of growth is possible in democratic countries without a culture change first. Because if we would be to protect those things which are outside of the traditional market dynamics, then that would go against the rationale of our current society, which is market driven. And for as long as that is, we will see these austerity politics and the neoliberal politics pushed, which say, you just have to empower the market and empower the growth, and then it will sort itself out. So actually, the legitimacy is missing, and I kind of don't see how to get that legitimacy to protect the practices you mentioned in the way that you mentioned in your presentation without having cultural change first. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Can I respond to that one while I remember? Yeah, my audio is on. Good. I mean, on Kim's comment, I just want to, I do appreciate the point. And I think that the value of having planners knowing their locality and sort of being on the ground, I think it is very strong. I think it does. And in the last chapter of the book, I raised the point that you do still have to think across scales. And of course, it isn't necessary to think about how you connect what happens at locality with other kinds of scales. But that seems to me an issue that planners have dealt with at various times and we could think about. I think, Casper, you raised some more fundamental issues here, but I suppose I think there is more scope for working in the gaps, working in the interstices, that it's not simply a matter of we have a pro-austerity neoliberal system and everything within it is operating according to the logic of that system, because I don't think that's the case. I think there are lots of things also already operating within a predominantly neoliberal, austerity-driven capitalist system that aren't driven by those logics, that involve, I mean, some people might see it as resistances, some might see it just as, everyday living within those. And so I don't think it's simply a matter of shifting from that to another system that is, with the benefit of legitimacy and with cultural change. I think it's more about working with those things that are already happening that seem to be positive features and seeking to expand them and strengthen them and grow them. So it's more about change from within rather than structural change of the way you're identifying. I mean, I also think it raises a question, like I said, this is a book about planning and for planners, and I do slightly question the role of what planners can do in terms of cultural change. I mean, they are not primarily cultural change agents. They are not, let us take it, the media, which has a more obvious role in that regard, or political actors as such. They're usually subservient to political actors. But they can operate through the remit of their supposed expertise and technocratic role to develop sort of things. So if they have to develop large-scale house building, they may do that through multiple ways, which will include perhaps more attention to cooperatives and to community land trusts, and self-build organizations than would have been the case if you were just going to go down the market route on its own. So I think it's more about working within the small grain of what is possible and growing and expanding at that from within what is currently possible. And I don't think, okay, I mean, planners may find themselves when they first go into a new job that they're told what to do and they don't see that as an opportunity. But I mean, all the cases I looked at, there were, they were in existence, and they were in existence partly because there had been some forms of support, either from the local state or, in some cases, from national and regional state. Not all the policies of a regional and national state all align towards neoliberalism, for instance. There may well be policies that you can use as resources to build these kind of initiatives. I hope that sort of speaks to.
Yeah, thanks. Casper, is your question a follow-up question related to her answer, or it's something
Yes,
different?
if I may.
Very quickly, yes.
Yes. So I do see that, and I do see the problems that you are pointing out. I do. And I do not think that planners should be a factor of cultural change top-down. That is not an option. However, I take the issue you raise about the urgency that we have in this situation very seriously. I do heavily agree on the need to have timely action. And I think, I mean, I guess it's a matter of judgment and finding out also. But I think my question would be how this proposal that you do to work in the interstices and affect a slow change through using the agency that is there right now, if that is enough to tackle the urgency that we have.
Well, I suppose it depends what you think the alternative is. And I mean, if I look at the world as it is now, and I don't see any prospect of that kind of broader cultural change and structural change happening. So, if you think there is actually a way to get that to happen within the timescale, then you will look at this differently. So maybe it's just a question of how we view the alternatives and their prospects. I mean, I see a question in the chat about socialist planning.
Yes.
And I have to say, it's not a word I think you would find in the index, I have to say. You can critique me for it, but I don't think it's there.
Okay, so we have actually a lot of questions. Maybe we can go in order and ask Sarah to ask her question. And then we move to Roger, and then we can read out one of the questions in the chat.
First, Yvonne, thanks for your presentation and the contributors and other questions for a very interesting debate and discussion. I wanted to pick up on the foundational economy aspect, and I haven't read the book yet, but I find it quite interesting, some of the discussions in the foundational economy group here in Vienna that is talking or coupling foundational economy systems with the concept of exnovation and the need to actually stop particular practices that are those harmful ones. So these ideas of enabling core and essential sectors of the economy, changing others, and actually shrinking or rid of certain sectors of the existing economy. Obviously, we can have a discussion about how that should happen. But I think this is also very interesting in relation to this concept of transformative climate actions as well, that looks at what is transformative, and this picks up on this idea of discussion around what is radical. What is transformative is very much dependent on the context. So in the US, a shift away from car dependency or onto public transport would be transformative, whereas in Europe, we already have high usage of that. So small shifts are less transformative, and it really depends on the context. So I wanted to ask two small questions. One being that if we think about this idea of exnovation as part of a change or a transition or transformation to a different system, are these sorts of economic practices that are more sustainable or more that are more sustainable need to be supported, but not as well as continuing to support and enable unsustainable sectors of the economy. So did you see any example or any evidence of that in the cases that you've investigated, that there was actually instead of type of support happening with those? And a second, not quite related question, but one that taps into how we might get about more transformative change is what your thoughts are on how we conceptualize who planners actually are, and what planning practices exist. And I'm drawing here on Faranak Muraftab's idea of insurgent planning practices. And so, yeah, if you had any thoughts on that.
Wow, that's a lot of very interesting points, Sarah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I do take your point about, you know, that there are sectors of the economy in a sense that that shouldn't be operating, that the harm they do is too great. How one goes about cutting them out, as you say, is a kind of issue. I mean, it's clear that sometimes there are opportunities that arise that politicians don't take. So in response to Trump tariffs, our government is going to support the car industry. You know, and my feeling is, well, is that the right thing to be doing? You know, but in a sense, that's a sort of a political debate that goes beyond planning per se. I think one of the things that you use the word ex-innovation, which I was not so familiar, but I have been thinking quite a lot about innovation in relation to this, and this connects with another question that's in the chat. And it seems to me that would be very helpful would be a shift in innovation and a focus on innovation away from the way it's currently understood in terms of large-scale technological change, towards a much greater emphasis on repair and maintenance. You know, that it's about how we maintain, improve, and make function better what we already have, rather than necessarily instituting new kinds of, you know, technological solution. And that goes back to Kim's point about digitalization as well, and smart cities and things like that. I mean, you know, to me, the central element of this is about valuing what we have, and improving what we have and the way that it actually functions within that as well. Insurgent planners, I mean, conceptually, I think this is very interesting. But, you know, there tends to be sometimes a grinding of gears about the way we conceptualize planning and planners and what is actually the variety of things that are actually happening out there. Yeah, I'm not saying that all planners work in local government. I think they work in a whole variety of different contexts, but, you know, they don't necessarily chime with that. I also feel, I mean, we do a lot of work in the Bartlett School of Planning, getting our planning students to work with local communities, which is absolutely brilliant work, done by a variety of my colleagues, and the students come out very, very excited by it. It feels to me even so that it's perhaps sometimes we're a bit too, again, focused on specific residential communities, and we could take that idea of working with localities. It might be more difficult to do, but we could take that in a broader kind of way. Whether that would fit with an idea of insurgent planners, I'm not quite sure. Like I said, I think the role of education is often to open people's eyes. You know, the responsibility that professional planners have when they go out in the field is slightly different in kind. And the values they work with in those situations, I think, becomes a matter of their kind of personal professional responsibilities. I don't think the professional bodies, I mean, we have quite a relatively strong professional body in the UK. I don't think they always operate with a broad enough notion of what planning could be up to.
Okay. Thanks, Yvonne. Roger.
Yeah, thanks. The whole concept of terms like degrowth and post-growth have always bugged me, and I've been trying to figure out how to explain it. And listening to this, I think I've got kind of an explanation that's come into my mind. And there's we all know that growth is a rubbish measure for like any sort of general concept of good. You know, say a country can be in a total war and its GDP will look amazing because it's making so many weapons and everything's getting wrecked and having to be rebuilt. So growth is just a terrible measure of how good things may be going in a society. You know, so to put it in physical terms, like biological terms, growth is like saying that growing a tumor is as good as growing muscle. But then if you go the other way and you go into like the degrowth and anti-growth world, you've sort of set yourself against an already bad measure. So that leads you into other strange pathways. And to go back to the body, that will be like saying losing a limb is as good as losing fat. It's the same sort of mess a lot of atheists get themselves into by just defining themselves in opposition to something they don't like. And I think that really the way to think about it is that growth is just a dumb idea from the start and should be thought of as irrelevant. And it's like to put it back again into physical terms, if you start eating like the best possible diet, go on a great exercise program, will your scale weight go up or down? And the correct answer is, who cares? You're doing the right thing, it'll go wherever it needs to go. And in terms of planning, I think the correct way to think about it in those terms is, if we build the world we want in the sort of constraints of sort of environment, industrial capacity and stuff, we'll get the world we want. Some things will go up, some things will come down, and it really doesn't matter. Can
I respond to that? I mean, you've used the word "we" several times, and I think one of the things that planning has been very, very good at understanding, both through practice and through its research, is that we live in a world of multiple voices. And one of the key challenges that planning does deal with, and I think we have taught our students and young practitioners to deal with, is how to deal with multiple voices. So, and I think that's sort of a bedrock that we mustn't forget in these debates about what individually we would like to happen, and individually what we think is important, and individually what we think is true. So the context within which this intervention is made is an intervention where planning is going to have to engage with a whole variety of different perspectives and a whole variety of different views in trying to deliver certain kinds of urban or rural future within that. And what I'm trying to do with these kind of initiatives, in a sense, is to get greater widespread support for these kind of initiatives, which might then have incrementally some kind of transformative effect and take one away from the obsession with growth. But I do think in these debates, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that planning fundamentally has to operate in a world of multiple voices, multiple stakeholders, multiple interests. And we can't just ride roughshod over different perspectives, and we need to think about how we're actually going to engage with that. I'm also be interested in Christian and Federico's views on some of the debates that's been going on so far, but I know there are other questions too, Yuri.
Yeah, we have actually several questions in the chat box. I will read a few out so that maybe a couple of them. I will write also as I'm in a busy context. So every time I hear and read about planning without growth, it is recurrent, the problem that it is of a small scale applicability. As a planner and design lecturer, I encounter continuously such questions from my students. Has the issue of scalability been covered in the literature about post-growth, degrowth? How to face the applicability within a persisting neoliberal scenario without thinking about its systemic scalable application? So this is one issue. There are a lot of comments to this question, but I won't read all of them. Yvonne, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the ideas you presented could be applied in the context of building renovation and energy efficiency and the cost of living crisis, both locally and nationally. I'm asking from a perspective of an activist and campaigner with Friends of the Earth, as well as an advocate for well-being donut and post-growth approaches. I have to leave for a meeting, so I will just put this in the chat, and we will, given that it's recorded, maybe he can listen to the answer afterwards. So maybe we stop with these two questions, and then we have another two questions afterwards.
Shall I go? I don't know.
Yes,
I'll let
go ahead.
You tell me when
Go
to
ahead.
open the floor to Frederico and Savini. Okay. Small scale and scalability. I mean, there are different ways of operating at a larger scale. It isn't necessarily the sense that you just take something and you make that thing bigger itself. It is possible to, in a sense, what I'm looking for here is greater replication, possibly as a better word. So multiple replication of these kinds of ways of thickening the diverse economy, strengthening the foundational economy in multiple different kind of contexts. And one of the advantages of planning is that it already exists, it already operates across many, many different locations and sites. And therefore it's an institutional basis for doing it in that kind of way. Like I said, I do think that doesn't mean everything has to happen on the ground in the locality. This isn't an argument for very pure localism in some sense. I think these things do connect up to the kind of governance support you get at regional and national scales, which is why I explicitly tried to address the issue of national, reforms to planning, although that always becomes a bit of a wish list. But also about how you connect up with aspects of urban and environmental change that necessarily happen at those larger scales. And I think the key one there is infrastructure. And I hear what Federico says about, well, infrastructure tends to very often be in the hands of major multinational corporations. But even so, there is still a degree of strength of planning, I think, around infrastructure at those higher scales that you don't necessarily get with other kinds of forms of urban change and such. So I think the issue about scalability is perhaps more about replication, about having a good, using the diverse, diffused resources of planners to achieve lots of replication, and having that supported at regional and national levels, both through policy frameworks and to some extent through the physicality of infrastructure systems as well. On the other question, I saw that question in the chat, which is why I made the point about repair and maintenance. I do think this does imply valuing what is there, as I've said, and a greater greater emphasis on how we can innovate in relation to repair and maintenance. And I think that covers a number of the aspects she's actually talking about. In terms of the cost of living crisis, I mean, I just point to the fact that many of these kind of initiatives are actually proving somewhat effective, I would say, in delivering goods and services outside of straightforward market processes to those in need. I mean, that's often presented as a bad thing, but I think it's also, in a sense, become an institutionalized way. And I mean, we have a local food bank near where we are. There's a queue outside it every Thursday morning for it. You could go past it and think people should be able to buy stuff in the shops. On the other hand, I see a lot of conversations and cheeriness happening outside the food bank as people go, and I mean, there's no shame in using a food bank, so why not sort of use it in that sense? So maybe we also just need to change our attitudes a little bit there.
That would help, definitely. I will read a few other questions. I don't know, Job, if you want to put your question yourself, or should I go ahead?
I can briefly explain where my question is coming from. My name is Job Zomerplaag. I'm based at the University of Maastricht in the south, but currently visiting the University of Vienna. Thank you for your talk, Yvonne. In my region, which is a former mining region, you actually see that there was a decline for a long time, and you actually saw that there was quite a lot of attention paid to post-growth as a concept, because it was suddenly something that people could be proud about. Again, for the past 2 decades, there was quite a lot of discourse. There were several conferences organized. There's also been a PhD thesis written about this, actually, as someone who graduated under Joanna Williams, I think recently, on circular cities as well. And it actually became something of pride. But now the city and the region is actually recovering. And you can actually see, and I was wondering whether this post-growth concept could also become quite a dirty concept in a way, where it's actually used.
A dirty concept, you
say?
Because
it can maybe hijacked in a way. And we might label things as post-growth or as examples of post-growth, but are in a sense actually just stimulating already growth paradigm that we already have in place. And whether you already found such examples in your work.
I mean, I think that's an interesting thing to study, the extent to which these kind of initiatives might actually initiate the movement back towards growth dependence. I mean, I think you see some of that happening in Detroit as well. There's a sort of classic example seen as resizing and these alternative initiatives, and then all of a sudden the capitalist interest in devalued land turns up and starts to create something else. I suppose it could. I mean, I think a lot of the cases I'm looking at are more peripheral in nature. And therefore, perhaps, I mean, Maastricht is quite a substantial place. I think maybe in more peripheral regions that may not come. But to be honest, I think this is a live question for research to actually see how that might evolve over time. Because what I've done is a fairly static analysis, and what you're pointing to is something that would be more dynamic and sort of hearing things over time.
Well, to be continued.
Yes.
Places that bounce back. Yeah.
Yes. And the student that you mentioned is Marija Marjanović's
Exactly.
work.
Yeah.
So I'll type it in the message, and I do recommend his work very much.
Which also
if people
takes an
want to.
evolutionary perspective. So
Yeah.
if we talk about looking back in time.
I guess we don't have much time to add many more.
May I just add shortly? Actually, the concept of gentrification talks exactly about using or turning deteriorated places into market development with this kind of symbolic imagining. Just my thought.
Yes.
Okay, then thank you.
So it was just a comment, Monica?
Yes.
Or you have also a question?
Or maybe your thoughts, question mark. But it can also be just a comment.
Okay. So I will read out maybe the last question. In my view, the socialism question cannot be bypassed when we consider post-growth. If you want to transform urban systems in such a way that they do not prioritize private profit and instead work towards social and ecological benefit, then how can that be realized if not by socializing urban amenities and productive systems? Question mark.
Well, I mean, I think, okay, to be an academic, it depends how you define socializing. I mean, the role of local communities, of social enterprises could be seen as a form of socializing. It doesn't have to be, through the mechanisms of the state. One can go back to the divergence that occurred between, the anarchists and the Marxists, and, the shifts that happened in the 19th century that took our view of socialism down a particular line. Yeah, I'm waiting for the socialists to develop more electoral support. I mean, when I see that happening, and I'll see that there's a public appetite for doing things in that kind of way, then I think that's something that we should say, yes, there is support and legitimacy for that, and we should think about how to use that and incorporate that in our, attempts to make urban environments, better, more sustainable, more equal kinds of places. That's not the place we're in at the moment. And I mean, I think it is quite frightening, the place we're in at the moment, and to think about how we actually, operate within that kind of space. And I just find it very unlikely that a term whose has its roots in a completely different context 2 centuries ago is going to directly speak to the current moment. I mean, I was reading about the new initiatives that are happening to try and revitalize the Democrat Party in America, which is going under the banner, what if we didn't suck? I mean, yeah, what if you weren't such a lousy political movement? But what is going to be the alternative? And I think we are in that moment of change. I mean, we have attempted that in the UK with looking back to, more straightforwardly left-wing approaches. They don't get the political support, at least in the UK. I wait to see it happening in other places. Yeah.
So your position is...
Yeah, he's got to point back Keir Starmer and Jeremy Corbyn in the chat.
Yeah.
I do appreciate that, but you got to... We can disagree about Jeremy Corbyn.
He's rather pessimistic.
No, I'm not. I think it's the time for change, and I think we need new ideas in the political sphere, not go back to the old ideas.
Yeah, definitely. Any further question or comment or issue you want to raise in the last few minutes?
Could we bring Federico and Christian back?
Yes.
I'm always interested to hear them.
If I may just add a quick comment to one of the last discussion points. I think this is not to confer a shrinking cities or shrinking regions debate with a post-growth debate, as I would say post-growth planning cannot be defined from the outcome. So let's say if people are leaving, economy is leaving, then that's post-growth. No, that is not post-growth. In reality, if we look at regions like Eastern Germany, I'm not sure about Maastricht, those are often the regions that are shrinking in population and economy, but even heavily using new land for building, heavily fostering policies that are pro-growth, more so than in Amsterdam or the large centers. So in that sense, I would separate that and say that something is shrinking is not a success story. So if planning works without growth, that's a success story. And then the question is, what is growth? Really in that, what is part of the GDP that we measure? Also, that has changed a lot over time. But not to say the idea of post-growth is not to have situations like Detroit everywhere. Rather the complete opposite to that.
Yes, definitely. So there is hope, you think, which is your issue. Okay. Federico, you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been listening with a lot of interest, and there is a lot of very nice points to take and also some recurrent elements. The most interesting for me is the latter point when Yvonne is talking about the concepts, the terminologies, and the political philosophies that we can use today, and the way they relate to the past, and the debate with socialism, etc., etc. I tend to agree with that. We cannot recycle things, and for sure we cannot take left eco-modernist perspectives to solve the problem of eco-modernism of today. So, and if we take a left eco-modernist perspective of socialists, that's clearly wrong. What I see as an opportunity, or at least as a gap where scientists can work on, social scientists can work on, is to really understand how this public common partnership models can work. So what is the space of the indeed a socialist state in regards with the liberation, let's say the libertarian view of commons and the way practices happen in the ground. So that balance needs to be really problematized, because it's quite clear to me nowadays that large-scale private ownership doesn't seem to deliver on social ecological targets that we have today, at least the large-scale one. Okay, so if we want to talk about large-scale, I think there was a very interesting debate about the education of planning. The point of Kim, which by the way is a co-author of the book Post-Growth Planning, the very first point was about the digitalization. For me, that is just an entry point to critique the fact that the planning knowledge, I think, is a bit disembodied today. And what I would do, I would not teach more economics, but I would teach more physics, ecology, and biology, because there is no planner in my school that knows where concrete comes from, while they just decide how to, build stuff out of concrete or wood or simply heat, so ecological knowledge, I think, would be the opportunity for educating our future planning professionals and geographers, by the way, just to put them all in one basket. And then the third, I think, social geographers. And the third point, which I think that was very important, was about this, this idea of the first steps, to use the word of Yvonne. So the point is, we are in a situation of a grow hegemony, and we are looking for a path that is, to a certain degree, counter-hegemonic, so that could develop a new view of the future from the present. But the present is, to a certain degree, stuck to a grow ideology. And so it is a bit of the chicken and the egg problem, right? So is the chicken or first the egg? Where do we start? Where do we take the first steps? I think this is a very good question. And I think the book of Yvonne clearly suggests, and I think this is good and I agree to actually start from what is already existing and to analyze what are the barriers that these economies face every day. And when we talk about barriers, we really talk about how, for example, subsidy systems are organized, how land ownership is organized, how taxation is organized, who is taxed, who is not taxed, how labor law is organized, So these are the conditions that allow us to, I mean, looking at this practice, we can learn from the systemic, for the systemic change. So that's what I would start, and maybe it goes back, in fact, to I think Yvonne's book very well, because that's what she does in her book. She just shows us the barriers and opportunities of these practices. So I recommend this reading very much.
Thank you. I mean,
Thanks a
can I
lot.
just finish by saying, I think what I really, really appreciate about these debates around post-growth and connecting to degrowth and other debates about growth is how we range across from quite pragmatic issues about what should be the institutional arrangements for building housing on this site, right through to these very much bigger debates. And I think that is incredibly healthy, to be able to take in both those dimensions of the detailed everyday practices of planners, but also the broader political context within which they are operating. And I think it's only by going back and forth between these two that we're actually going to find our path, you know, our steps forward, you know, because we need to think about both those sort of levels of conceptualization.
Indeed.
And thank you for the, you know, the fascinating debates that your group has contributed.
So starting from the practice and looking for replicability in a way.
Yeah, and keeping the big debate going at the same time.
Going on, yes, definitely. So thanks really a lot for insightful presentation and very interesting debate.
There
Also
might be
Federico and Christian, yes?
There is maybe one final question in the chat that might conclude everything. That's a really lovely question. It goes, what would you, Yvonne Rydin, advise spatial planning students on integrating planning without growth better in their studies, thesis, and future work? So I think this is a lovely final word.
Well, I think it's about thinking outside the box. Don't take the options that you are offered, you know, for granted and, you know, as gospel. You know, if it's presented in a certain kind of way, always question, why is it presented that kind of way? Why is it a good idea to have more development? Why does this development have to be this balance of affordable and non-affordable? Question what the recipe of offers are and think outside that box, because, you know, it's only by thinking outside of what we're given as, you know, assumed to be the way to do things that we're going to progress this agenda.
That's a perfect final word. So never take things for granted and
always
think outside
question
of the box. Absolutely. So thanks a lot, everybody, and also particularly to Yvonne, Federico, and Christian, and all the audience. And keep in touch for the next Hot Over Press, which will be in May, on the 7th of May, with Benjamin Bradlow discussing about São Paulo and Johannesburg, about urban power. So keep in touch, and thanks a lot to everybody. Bye.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.